The city had always been a bustling hub of activity, its streets lined with towering skyscrapers and neon lights that never seemed to fade. People walked in a rush, immersed in their own lives, unaware of the storm brewing just beyond their doorstep. But that changed one fateful morning. It started with a low hum of unease, a news report flickering on every screen, hinting at a strange virus sweeping through the city. At first, no one thought much of it. The flu had come and gone 100 times before. But this virus was different. People weren't just falling ill. They were changing. They were becoming something else. Detective Rachel Ward had seen her fair share of grisly crime scenes, but nothing could prepare her for the horrors that awaited her on the streets. The day began like any other, but by noon, chaos reigned. The sirens blared as emergency vehicles sped past, their flashing lights reflecting off the glass windows of the buildings that lined Main Street. People began running in panic, pushing each other to the ground, desperate to escape whatever it was that had taken hold of the city. Rachel had just finished a coffee at her favorite cafe when the scream started. First, it was distant, like the wind carrying a faint cry. But then, it grew louder, sharp, desperate, filled with terror. A young woman burst through the cafe door, her face twisted in fear. Blood stained her clothes, and her breath came in ragged gasps. "They're everywhere," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're not human anymore." Before Rachel could respond, the woman collapsed, convulsing on the floor. Seconds later, a growl echoed from outside. Rachel's heart pounded as the first of them appeared, figures stumbling through the streets with a grotesque, jerking gait. Their skin was pale, mottled, as if life had long since drained from their bodies. They shuffled forward, their eyes vacant, their mouths dripping with blood. The people still in the cafe stared in disbelief, paralyzed by shock. The growl grew louder, closer. Rachel stood frozen for a moment, but then instinct kicked in. Grabbing the woman's arm, she dragged her to the back exit. Her mind raced. Where could she go? How could she survive? As she pushed through the door into the alley, the streets outside were no better. Chaos had descended. A car swerved around the corner, crashing into a lamppost, as the driver desperately tried to escape. But it was too late. The Undead had reached the main road. Rachel ducked behind a dumpster, trying to steady her breathing, as she heard the unmistakable sound of moaning. She risked a glance, seeing the first wave of infected emerging from a nearby building, their bodies stiff, their eyes scanning the streets like predators hunting for prey. A sharp bang echoed through the alley as a car door slammed open, and a man in a military jacket appeared, his rifle raised. "Get in," he shouted, his voice stern but filled with urgency. Rachel didn't hesitate. She grabbed the injured woman and hurried into the vehicle, slamming the door behind her. The man gunned the engine, and the car sped off, weaving through the city streets, dodging wrecks and piles of abandoned cars. "Where are we going?" Rachel asked, trying to catch her breath. "To the city's perimeter," he said, keeping his eyes on the road. "We're going to try to hold them off long enough to set up a defense. We've got a few other survivors, but the numbers are growing fast. We need to get to the checkpoint before they surround us." Rachel's mind raced as she glanced back at the chaos behind them. It was no longer just a few infected. What had started as isolated incidents had now grown into a full-scale assault. The Undead were everywhere, their numbers swelling by the minute, like a tidal wave of death and decay. As they neared the edge of the city, Rachel could see the barricades in the distance, makeshift defenses manned by soldiers and civilians alike. But even from here, she could see the problem. The Horde was relentless, and there were too many of them. "We can't hold them off for long," the man muttered under his breath, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. Suddenly, a loud crash rattled the car, throwing them all forward. The driver swerved, narrowly avoiding a massive pileup ahead. A wave of infected had ambushed the road, charging straight for them. "Hang on," the driver shouted, slamming the brakes. The car came to a screeching halt, just inches from the Undead. The fight for survival was just beginning. Rachel could feel the weight of the situation pressing on her. There was no escape. The city was a war zone, and the streets had become the battleground for humanity's very survival. The car came to a jolting stop, and for a heartbeat, everything felt suspended in time. The low growls of the infected grew louder, closer. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as she glanced around at the chaos that had enveloped the streets. She could see them now, thousands of them, shuffling toward the barricade in the distance, clawing at anything in their path, desperate for fresh prey. "Get out now," the man beside her barked, his eyes wide with urgency. He was a soldier, Rachel could tell by his demeanor, but even he seemed rattled by the sheer scale of what was unfolding. Without thinking, Rachel threw open the door, pulling the injured woman with her. The air outside was thick with the scent of smoke and death. The sounds of chaos echoed off the buildings, a constant crescendo of screams, growls, and the sickening squelch of undead limbs dragging across the pavement. They had reached the edge of a city, but the city itself had become a prison, a labyrinth of crumbling walls, abandoned vehicles, and desperate survivors trying to hold their ground. "Where's the checkpoint?" Rachel shouted over the din of the streets, her voice hoarse with fear. "It's just ahead," the soldier replied, his voice grim. "But it's not safe. They're everywhere. We need to move fast." They sprinted toward the checkpoint, the injured woman struggling to keep up. Her breathing labored. Rachel's eyes darted around as she led the group, scanning for any sign of safety or escape. But the further they went, the more apparent it became that the city was lost. Every alley was a dead end, every street was clogged with wreckage, and every corner seemed to hide more of the infected, drawn by the sound of footsteps, by the stench of living flesh. Suddenly, a scream echoed from behind them, high-pitched and frantic. Rachel turned just in time to see a man, his clothes torn, stumbling toward them. His face was half covered in blood, his eyes wide with terror. He reached out a shaking hand, but it was too late. A horde of infected had spotted him and was now charging toward them with terrifying speed. "Run," the soldier yelled, shoving Rachel forward. Rachel didn't need any more encouragement. She sprinted, her breath ragged, her muscles aching from the strain. The sound of growling and shuffling feet behind them urged her on, but she couldn't shake the image of the man being dragged to the ground, his screams swallowed by the ravenous crowd. They reached the checkpoint at last, only to find it in chaos. The barricade had been partially breached, and soldiers were scrambling to reinforce the defenses. But even as Rachel and her group approached, the tide of infected was closing in from every direction. They were surrounded. There was no way out. A soldier spotted them and waved them through, shouting orders to the others. "Get inside the building. Now." They made a mad dash for the door, barely squeezing through before a massive wave of undead slammed into the barricade. The metal gates groaned under the pressure as the soldiers scrambled to hold their position, firing their rifles into the oncoming horde. The sound of gunfire echoed through the air, mingling with the feral growls of the infected. Inside the building, it was eerily quiet except for the sound of heavy breathing and the occasional distant explosion. Rachel's legs felt like jelly as she collapsed against the wall, trying to catch her breath. The soldier who had rescued her stood nearby, his rifle still raised, scanning the room for threats. "We're not safe yet," he said, his voice tight with tension. "They'll find a way in eventually. We need to prepare for what's coming." Rachel nodded, her mind racing. She had never been a soldier, but she knew that they couldn't just hide forever. The infected were relentless, and no matter how strong their defenses were, they wouldn't hold forever. Across the room, Rachel noticed a small group of survivors huddled together, their faces pale with fear. Some were clutching weapons, others just staring into space, lost in their own thoughts. There were children among them, too young to understand the horrors surrounding them. A wave of guilt washed over her. How could they survive this? How could anyone? "What's the plan?" she asked the soldier, who was now joining a group of men at a table, hastily forming a strategy. "We fight. We hold the line," he said, his tone hardening. "But we need to be prepared for anything. We've got a few explosives, but not enough to take down the whole horde. We'll need to set traps, create diversions. The key is keeping them distracted long enough to break through their numbers." Rachel nodded, her mind clicking into survival mode. She wasn't just a detective anymore. She was a survivor, and she would do whatever it took to stay alive. Outside, the first of the infected slammed into the barricades, their fists pounding against the steel gates. It was the beginning of the end, and the streets of the city were no longer a place for the living. Now it was a war zone, and the fight for survival was about to get much worse. The building was a temporary refuge, but Rachel knew it wouldn't be enough to save them for long. Outside, the horde of infected was growing, pressing against the barricades with unrelenting force. She could hear the distant shouts of soldiers coordinating their efforts, but the sounds of battle were quickly being drowned out by the feral growls of the undead as they clawed at the steel gates. "We've got about an hour, maybe two, before they break through," the soldier leader, Lieutenant Pierce, said, his voice grim. His brow was furrowed as he peered out of a small window, assessing the enemy's numbers. "We need to act fast." Rachel nodded, trying to push away the rising sense of dread in her chest. The stakes were higher than ever. She'd seen the horrors of the infected up close now, but this was different. They were outnumbered, and the chances of making it through alive seemed slimmer by the minute. Lieutenant Pierce turned to a nearby group of civilians who had been sitting in stunned silence. "All right, you need to be ready. We'll need everyone to do their part, even if it's just a small task. If we're going to survive this, we can't afford to hesitate." Rachel's gaze lingered on the civilians, some of them too young, too old, or too wounded to fight. But there was no time for weakness. She caught the eye of a woman in the corner, her arms wrapped tightly around her child. Her face was a mask of terror, but in her eyes, Rachel saw the same fierce resolve she'd been feeling herself. The desire to protect, to fight, to survive. "You," Rachel said, motioning to the woman. "I need your help. We've got to fortify the windows and doors. If they breach, we're stuck." The woman nodded, her hands shaking, but she didn't hesitate. The survivors moved quickly, some helping with barricades, others collecting anything they could use as weapons, poles, broken glass, even makeshift Molotov cocktails. Rachel was at the front of the action, directing people to various tasks. She couldn't afford to be afraid. Not now. Not when so many lives depended on her. She was just one person in a sea of panic, but if she could keep everyone focused, keep them from losing hope, they might stand a chance. Outside, the air grew thick with tension. The sound of the undead grew louder as they battered against the gates, their claws scraping against the metal, their snarls reverberating through the walls. But it was the eerie silence that followed each wave of growls that unsettled Rachel. The infected weren't stupid. They were waiting, watching, and their patience was a deadly weapon. "We need a diversion," Pierce said, his voice cutting through the chaos inside the building. He turned to a group of soldiers who had gathered around a table, strategizing. "Set up explosives near the main street. When they breach, we'll use the blast to draw them away long enough to break through." Rachel overheard the plan and felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The explosion was a risky move, but they didn't have time for hesitation. It was now or never. "Count me in," she said, stepping forward. "I'll help you set the charges." Pierce looked her over, his face softening for a moment. "Are you sure? It's dangerous." "I can't guarantee." "I'm not going to sit back while everyone else fights," Rachel interrupted, her voice firm. "We all have a role to play in this." The soldiers quickly set to work, preparing the explosives near the street's edge. Rachel helped plant the devices, her hands trembling slightly, but her resolve never wavered. She had seen what the infected were capable of. If they didn't act now, the city would fall, and with it, any hope of survival. As they finished, the first breach happened. A loud crash echoed through the building as the gates shuddered, buckling under the relentless force of the infected. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, the gates exploded inward, and the horde poured in, a tidal wave of decayed flesh and hunger. The soldiers opened fire, their guns roaring, but the onslaught was overwhelming. "Now," Pierce shouted, and with that command, the explosion tore through the streets. The ground shook as the blast sent a shockwave through the city. The infected closest to the blast were torn apart, their bodies flung into the air like ragdolls. The shockwave caused a temporary lull in the Horde's advance, as they were momentarily disoriented by the chaos. But it wasn't enough. More infected were still flooding the area, and they were beginning to regroup, their primal instincts driving them toward the nearest source of food. "Fall back. To the building," Pierce shouted. The survivors rushed inside, retreating to the relative safety of the fortified structure. But the threat was far from over. The blast had bought them a few precious minutes, but as they watched the carnage unfold, it was clear that the true battle was just beginning. They were trapped, and the infected were closing in from all sides. Inside, Rachel grabbed a rifle and took a deep breath. She could feel the weight of the weapon in her hands, but it was a necessary burden. She wasn't a soldier, but she would fight like one. There was no turning back now. The Warzone had descended into the very heart of the city, and the fight for survival had only just begun. The building was now a fortress of desperation. The barricades had been reinforced with everything the survivors could find: wooden planks, furniture, broken doors, anything that might slow the relentless tide of the infected. The sound of gunfire rang out intermittently, followed by the bone-chilling growls of the Horde just outside the walls. Rachel stood by the window, her rifle aimed at the street, watching as the infected moved like a wave, slow but inevitable. "How long do you think we can hold out?" one of the soldiers, Private Harris, asked, his voice tinged with fear. Rachel didn't answer immediately. She had no idea. In the silence that followed, the truth became painfully clear. This was it. There were no reinforcements coming, no helicopters to airlift them to safety. It was just them, the survivors, and a city consumed by the undead. Lieutenant Pierce walked over to where Rachel stood. His face was ashen, his eyes tired, but his resolve was unshaken. He clapped her on the shoulder. "We're in this together now. We'll fight until we can't anymore." Rachel nodded, tightening her grip on the rifle. Her thoughts raced. She had to stay focused, had to keep the others focused. They weren't just fighting for their own survival. They were fighting for something greater. They were fighting for the chance to see another day, for the hope that somehow, against all odds, humanity could prevail. The sound of the infected's growls grew louder, their footsteps reverberating through the building as they neared the barricade. The infected were everywhere now, filling the streets, trying to claw their way through any opening they could find. There was no time left to prepare. They had reached the breaking point. "Get ready," Pierce yelled, motioning for everyone to take their positions. "We're going to make our stand here. Don't let them break through, no matter what." The survivors, now fully armed, took their positions at the windows, doorways, and staircases. The children huddled in the center of the room, surrounded by the older civilians, their faces pale with terror, but hardened with determination. The soldiers moved into defensive positions, their rifles raised, ready to fight. Rachel found herself at the front, standing next to Pierce, rifle in hand, her heart racing. She didn't want to look at the infected, but she couldn't help it. There were too many of them, and they were closing in. The first wave of infected slammed into the barricades, their bodies throwing themselves against the walls like mindless, ravenous animals. The soldiers opened fire, their bullets ripping through the air, but it was like trying to stop a tidal wave with a handful of pebbles. The infected were relentless. "Hold the line," Pierce shouted, his voice full of urgency. Rachel fired into the swarm, her shots careful, aimed at the nearest threats, but it wasn't enough. They kept coming, undeterred, relentless. The barricade splintered under the weight of the undead, groaning as the infected tore through it, reaching for anything alive. It was a nightmare, a constant flood of teeth and claws, of bodies pressing in, closer and closer. Rachel's rifle clicked empty. She grabbed another magazine, slamming it into place, her hand shaking but steady enough to reload. The sound of gunfire was deafening, the shouts of soldiers blending with the horrific growls of the undead. Then, with a loud crack, one of the barricades gave way. The first infected surged through the hole, and within seconds, the room was filled with them. Soldiers yelled, firing their rifles at point-blank range, but the onslaught was too much. A soldier fell, screaming, as the infected swarmed over him. Another soldier was dragged to the ground, his cries cut short as the undead tore him apart. Rachel's pulse raced as she fired, her shots finding their marks in the heads of the infected. She could see the others fighting too, every soldier, every civilian, armed with whatever they could find, standing their ground. The room became a blur of movement, of desperate survival. "Fall back to the stairwell," Pierce ordered. "We need to get to the roof." Rachel turned, already knowing what he meant. The building had a rooftop escape plan, a possible last chance to signal for help, if help was even coming. The survivors, now reduced in number, ran toward the stairs, fighting off the infected as they made their way upward. "Move, move," Rachel shouted, pushing the injured and the children forward, keeping a rear guard. The stairs were narrow, crowded with panicked survivors trying to reach safety. The infected were everywhere, but they were slowly being pushed back as the survivors fought tooth and nail to buy time. They reached the rooftop, gasping for breath, but there was no time to rest. The skyline stretched out before them, but it was empty, silent. No rescue choppers, no reinforcements. Just an endless city swallowed by death. Rachel ran to the edge, pulling out a flare gun from a supply pack and aiming it into the sky. She fired it, the flare soaring upward, casting a bright arc of red across the darkening sky. It was a desperate move, but they had nothing left to lose. Suddenly, a distant hum filled the air. It started faint, but grew louder. The flare had done something. They weren't alone. A helicopter appeared on the horizon, its blades cutting through the air, heading toward them. Relief flooded Rachel's chest, followed by a rush of adrenaline. It was coming. They were going to make it. But even as the helicopter neared, the ground trembled beneath their feet. The infected had followed them to the roof, now surging forward in a final, frantic attempt to claim their prey. They were surrounded once more. "Get on the chopper," Pierce yelled. Now, Rachel helped the last of the civilians onto the helicopter, her heart in her throat as the soldiers held off the infected, buying time with their final breaths. She was the last aboard, and just as the helicopter's blades roared to life, she heard a loud screech, a deafening cry from the undead. As the helicopter ascended, the city below them looked like a war zone, its once proud streets now swallowed by death. But for the first time in hours, Rachel allowed herself to breathe. They had survived. They had made it out, for now. And as the helicopter flew into the night sky, Rachel knew that the fight wasn't over. The war for humanity had just begun.